Welcome, everyone. Welcome. This is the third installment of the Archives and Heritage for Palestine speaker series. We're very, very grateful to welcome Dr. Rana Barakat. This is our third installment following previous installments with Dr. Salman Abu Sitta and Susan Abu Halwa. This series was put together really to respond to the ongoing and urgent situation in Palestine, where alongside the people of Gaza, we are witnessing, alongside their genocide, we're witnessing the destruction and heritage of heritage sites, archives, museums, libraries, and tangible cultural heritage. This is a year-long series, and it's an initiative to provide solidarity with our Palestinian colleagues and institutions in both Palestine and the diaspora. It's also an opportunity to amplify their amazing and courageous work within the archives and heritage sectors at large. This genocide didn't begin on October 7th, and as the work of the scholars in this series really showcases, they've been working for years to safeguard the heritage and history and memory of Palestine against Israel's ongoing ethnic cleansing. So before we begin, I'd like us all to take a moment of silence for all the martyrs that have been killed by Israel's brutal genocide in Gaza and Palestine at large, in Lebanon and the surrounding regions. So we'll just take a minute. Thank you. I'd like to also take the time to do a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to acknowledge the land on which I live and work. I'm located in Michigan in the United States, but this speaker series is truly a global endeavor that's made possible through the labor of people and organizations across Turtle Island. And I understand that our audience is pretty global as well, so I encourage you all to reflect on your own positionalities within the land on which you reside. Michigan, especially the University of Michigan, where I am, resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabeg, Three Fire Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Wyandot Nation. This land was obtained under coercive and dishonest treaties common in the colonization and the expansion of the United States. This land was ceded under the promise that the University of Michigan would provide education and service to the descendants of the traditional people of this land, a promise that was never kept. In acknowledging this painful history, I'm advocating for all indigenous struggles against ongoing settler colonization and strive for a decolonized future in the US, in Palestine, and in all colonized nations. As well, as I said, the speaker series wouldn't be possible without the labor and support of all our partners and sponsors, so I'd like to extend my gratitude towards them. This series is a joint initiative of the Middle East Librarians Association and the Archives and Heritage for Palestine Advocacy Subgroup, as well as the American University of Beirut's Palestine Land Studies Center, Publishers for Palestine, and the Archives and Digital Media Lab. We're also sponsored by the Lebanese Library Association, City University of New York's Archival Technologies Lab, Library Freedom, We Hear, and Uproot. So I am one of your co-hosts. I'm Rayan. I'll introduce myself. I'm a Palestinian first and foremost. I was born in diaspora. I'm also a PhD candidate at the School of Information at the University of Michigan, specializing in archives and digital curation. I did my Master's of Information and a Master of Art at the University of Toronto, so I also have roots in Canada. My research is largely focused on Zionist erasure and how to deconstruct how colonialism operates through archival infrastructures, as well as how we can build more transformative archival representations of those who have been impacted. And then I will pass it to my co-host, Dr. Jamila Ghaddar, to introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Tam. Yes, my name is Jamila Ghaddar. I'm an assistant professor at Dalhousie University in Mi'kma'ki. That's the unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq in what's called Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I actually come to you today from the land of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, the district of Wanspoon Wampum Belt Covenant lands in Toronto, or what's known as Toronto in also settler Canada. I am a Lebanese educator, feminist, historian, and scholar from South Lebanon, and also someone who believes strongly in education, advocacy, and research tying it to liberation. So as part of that, I co-convened a reading group with Dr. James Lowry at Connie on archival liberation in and beyond Palestine, documentary Nakba. And we issued a statement that I would like to encourage all of you to take the time to sign if you haven't yet today. It's a call to archive against genocide, archivists and memory workers in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian colleagues. We have well over 500 signatures already from around the world, and join them now, join your voice to our calls for boycott and divestment and sanctions against Israeli institutions, for decolonization and anti-colonial work, our calls to end the surveillance, the erasures, the archival destruction. You can read that all in the statement by looking at the comments right now. The QR code is in the comments. The link will be posted as well. And again, you can see all the other people, over 641 people from all over the world as archival professionals, heritage professionals, librarians, signing this historic statement, the first one of its kind in our fields to call for a censoring of the Zionist state towards genocide, war crimes, and cultural genocide in specific. Without further ado, I'd like to turn our attention now to the main feature of this event, which we're more than excited about. Rana, I've been following your work for years. So has Tam. You were one of the first names that occurred to us when we put together a list of who to bring. I'm going to just pull out a couple of things from your bio, but we'll also put that in the chat for everyone to read completely. Dr. Barakat is coming to us today. Thank you so much from Berzit in occupied Palestine. And we're going to just hope as much as possible that the internet stays with us. We know that this is part of the ways in which Palestinian people are besieged, are silenced, are disconnected from the world through communication, internet, different kinds of infrastructure. So we're all going to be as patient and understanding if there are any kinds of issues, as unfortunately there happen to be usually. Dr. Barakat is Associate Professor of History and Contemporary Arab Studies and Director of the Museum at Berzit University in Palestine. You can see right away why this is a voice we need to all hear. And her research interests include the history and historiography of colonialism, nationalism, and cultures of resistance. And again, we'll put the rest of the bio in the chat, but I really do want to call out some of her recent work and her forthcoming work as well. There's a forthcoming book on Lifta and resisting the musification of Palestine, indigenous history of the Nakba. There's also the Berwick Revolt, constructing a history of resistance in Palestine, which would be her next book. And there's also, of course, many years of publications that these are building on. We're going to hand it over to Dr. Barakat to do a brief presentation, following which we'll have a bit of a chat with Tam, myself, and Rana, and then we'll take some questions depending on how much time we have through the comments section if you'd like to post there. And we expect the event to last about an hour in total, but we're going to be flexible because these are important conversations. So without further ado, please go ahead, Dr. Barakat.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is everything good? Okay. I want to thank you all for generously inviting me into this space and for that introduction, and to be a part of this ongoing conversation. The very topic of heritage and archives in the midst of a genocide requires us to think about why we're talking about the past. What past? Whose past? Whose imaginations frame these notions of the past? And of course, we have to hold space for the horror that we bear in this time of genocide in our present, to take the faithful leap that we are and will remain world making. This is the dystopia, the time of monsters and the settlers that represent them. This is not new. But we also, I think, trust that however much this horror targets us as a people, we are and shall remain a people. It's almost absurd to think about how nuanced our understanding of the past and the material that holds these pasts, be it heritage or archives, can even be part of a conversation in the midst of this indescribable murder and destruction. Nearly 13 months into this latest iteration of the genocide against Palestine and Palestinians, the relentless violence is ever increasing and ever more destructive, as we see in Lebanon and beyond. It may at first seem audacious to permit ourselves to think about material history. Perhaps it is, but I would argue it's also never more important to have this conversation, for it is a part of our existential survival. Our vitality as a people remains a means to understand what Palestine and Palestinians teach the world. As in any conversation about Palestine and Palestinians, and especially so in the last year, we must scream out against the genocide. I hope we can nurture a good conversation today, but I want to begin with some words about why history matters. It's difficult to not be stuck in presentism in the midst of genocide. Survival as people and as a people is paramount, and remaining present is a singularly phenomenal task. But in the midst of all of this, the present cannot be removed from the past, and yes, our futures. That is the point I would like to frame everything I offer today. Palestine teaches us, and Palestinian historians have taught me, that this constructed divide in temporality, past, present, future, are not ours and does our work a great disservice. In fact, as so many have shared before me, and as we all know in our own lives, through the power of storytelling, we defy these constructed boundaries. The past is alive inside of us, in our stories, and in how we share our stories. When we frame preservation of material past in a cleanly divided when we frame preservation of our material past in a cleanly divided temporality that contains and constricts, it may lead us into what I've written about under the conceptual heading of museumification. That is, if we fall into a colonial and settler temporality, the equation forced upon us is what many indigenous scholars have named the indigenous bind. While complicated, it is also quite simple. The past, including what remains of its material reality, is all that we have left. And to preserve it, we have to give into settler time and settler power and settler methodologies and settler lexicons and settler power. At its most obvious, that this becomes a process that is reproducing an archive or a museum or even a gallery and practice that is simply not ours. In this colonial equation, to protect our past, we have to allow it to be buried not only in the past, but to have long since passed, leaving no space for breathing, for change, for ourselves in the present and for our people in the future. Worse still, as we see in the indescribable destruction in Gaza right now, throughout Palestine right now, in Lebanon right now, if we do not give in, then we face a situation where nothing is left. That is what settler power is. Elimination in all of its forms that wields its toolbox of violent destruction on all parts of us as a people. I do not mean to suggest that archives and libraries and museums are not potentially powerful places. To see the danger these places and practices present to settler power, settler narratives, and settler anxieties, one can simply bear witness to the level of destruction on and in Gaza as literally every institution and every person in these institutions have been targeted, destroyed, and murdered. The documentation of destruction, for example, is mind-blowing. The work of every sponsoring institution for this program stand testament to the vital work of protection and fighting this vicious erasure. But again, history matters because this is not new. I've said this so often in the last year that I fear I just keep repeating myself. But while everything has been madly intensified, the violence of Zionist settler erasure is not new. Colonial dispossession is not new. This is over a century of attempts at elimination and annihilation in Palestine and over 5 centuries in the world. But what I suppose I'm trying to convey, perhaps almost in spite of the destruction, if not only because of it, is that history and historiography matters. This is a multifaceted challenge because it opens up questions that perhaps preservation does not enable or even allow us to consider. If we turn this question into one about process, methodology, practice, then maybe we can get to the heart of this all. I realize that many people here are archivists or people who work in and care about heritage protection. Because of that, I want to ask here and ask us to consider what it means to think about the past not removed from a living and active and vital and alive future. I also know this question is almost an impossible one, for it requires us now to allow for a delusion in a time of genocide. But perhaps I might offer a different concept or conceptual way of understanding this, far removed from the world of settler and colonial epistemologies and ontologies. I suppose what I'm asking for us is to allow ourselves to live with the idea and imaginations for and about our futures. If we consider or perhaps reconsider our methodologies, if we take this up as a challenge, where does our work of collecting and caring take us? The hard work of 3 generations of historians, archivists, and collectors, as a part of our alive and vital work of Palestinian storytelling, is an awesome foundation and has enabled us to ask these questions. Lest I be misunderstood, working with the past after 1948 is an enormous challenge for historians of Palestine because of the well-documented looting and destruction. Settlers have been working to erase us for generations. But the work of all of those who came before us to document the colonial mandate era into the Nakba War, for example, offers subsequent generations the ability to now critique and open up the template and paradigm of historical methodologies. Fighting erasure and building what has been called in its wild and various iterations in Palestine, as well as regionally and internationally, alternative archives and museums as places for his heritage preservation, is now the work that we can draw from. Because of the achievements of the work of these previous generations, we must now critically think about the phrase used to launch this programming, archives as resistance. Documentation and collecting, as important as it is, cannot be the only part of our work. We are not native informants, nor should we strive to offer native information, for that falls into the politics of recognition that I alluded to earlier. What I have to say is quite simple. Our work is not about being recognized by the very powers that work to destroy us. Erasure is violent. It is mind-breaking and soul-crushing. It is now encapsulated in the indescribable situation of nearly 13 months of relentless bombing and vicious war-making. Our goals are not to achieve in this soulless world recognition from these monsters. But we also fight erasure in all the forms it comes at us, and with all the tools that we have to fight. For you, for us, it is incumbent upon us, upon those who are caretakers of the past, to scream against this genocide, to work to expose all of the horrors of this American-Israeli war against the people of Palestine and Lebanon, and our Arab culture, and for the future of the collective world. It is not a time for hesitation and is a time for action. Documentation and protection are, of course, part and parcel of our work. I've simply been asking us to consider how we document and for us to imagine the world that we want to achieve through this. Audacious challenges indeed in this cruel, cruel moment. In Palestine and among Palestinians, as I've mentioned, documentation of the Nakba War and forced expulsion of nearly 3/4 of our people from their homes may once have been grounded in the conceptual theme of fear of forgetting. I would argue that we always knew we would not forget, but at least now we all know that we did not nor will not forget. So we can expand Palestinian methodologies of documentation and collection to explore how and why we remember. Simply put, documentation grounded in return is far different than documentation burdened by the fear of forgetting. Documentation grounded in a sense of belonging that I've often described as us belonging to Palestine enables us to dismantle the burden of property relations to the land, confined and constricted by modern capitalism, and open up our worlds and work with a relationality that holds our pasts in our present towards our futures. Our belonging to each other and to Palestine and our wider understanding of return as an ongoing methodology. Gathering rather than collecting, be it of ourselves and our historical materials, can equally enable us to dismantle the capitalist and reductive practice of colonial museums and colonizing methodologies that are part of the work of mass murder in the present, denial and erasure of the past to prevent futures. These are, I hope, are not merely rhetorical gestures, but rather part of our ever-expanding work of imagining how and why we gather. I perhaps talked too long now, and I do want this to be a conversation beyond my own words and voice. But I would like to simply point out that over the course of the last 3 years in Birzeit University Museum, we've been asking these questions as we transform them into a pedagogical practice and engagement with our collections. We are caretakers of intellectualism in all of its wonderful forms and caretakers of tangible material. We are phenomenally aware of destruction, of our pasts and of our present. Destructing and looting of archives are the playbook for settlers for more than 5 centuries. What the settlers want to achieve, in spite of all the indescribable violence of this moment, will not be achieved. We belong to this land and all that she has to offer. That simple historical reality, however bruised and battered it is right now, will not change. It is our work to gather and share stories in and on and of this land.
Thank you, Dr. Barakat. Thank you so much, Rana. There's actually a million questions. Thank you. Just everything you said. Part of what I heard you say is certainly that we don't caretake and preserve the past for its own sake. And that actually there's something profoundly disturbing to do that in the context of a genocide especially. And the call being, how do we tie that work to the ongoing struggle and to Palestinian liberation proper? I want to hear so much more about what you do at the museum there at Birzeit. And I want to hear so much more about what it could look like to connect and create and imagine a history of Palestine that goes beyond all of this colonial history. But I'm supposed to ask you one specific question, and we'll start there before I then turn it back to Tam. One thing we'd like to invite you to elaborate on is how Palestine's historiography is or can be written right now. I mean, this is exactly what you said, is a very difficult thing to comprehend. And maybe also to speak to the successes and challenges of some of these interventions that are orienting this historiography back towards Gazans, with a note that, of course, Orient comes from, Orientalism and all its racist. Anyway, please go ahead, Rana.
I think this is, it's a powerful question, but I kind of would like to turn it on its head because there's so many ways to engage this. And I think that's the work of this gathering. I understand that there was a reading group and then a bayan, a statement, and then these sessions. So I think this is what we do, right? It's not about making a project. I think right now there's this existential need to think about documenting while we document. So there are people on the ground in Gaza and Palestinians from Gaza who've been working tirelessly to document and expand on this existential act of documentation. librarians and archivists for Palestine, for example, have put out a report and are working with numerous folks on the ground and organizations in Gaza. Likewise, we see the sector of higher education involved in this. And I know that all of these efforts are connected because they have to be. It's a difficult task in the midst of, as I said, all of this destruction, but the stories of Gaza are actually being told and heard. In the previous session, I know that you mentioned, Jamila, that you were archiving social media as part of one of the projects at AUB. That widely expands how we think about static notions of what archives are in terms of structure and what sources are in terms of material. And so I don't think we're necessarily turning back to or orienting historiography back to Gaza, but rather I think Gaza and Palestine is changing how we think generally, and how we engage in the practice of writing history, how we think about what historiography is. And I think one of the things when we gather like this to think about, and we're thinking about it because of the existential nature of it, is what is a historical source? What does it mean to read something and engage something? What does it mean to think about how we're gathering and collecting them for what? Part of the existential right now is there's just so much destruction, and it's difficult in the face of mass murder to think about tangible heritage. But I think we see in praxis and process how that's happening, right? So people are sharing their stories, and their stories are part of what we're understanding as far as history, both history and historiography. And the obvious connections of the last, back to 48 and of the last 80 years of Palestinian history. So what maybe 3 years ago we were trying to argue is, an ongoing Nakba is now being live streamed. There's no need to argue it. So then the challenge becomes, what do we do next? And I think one of the greatest challenges that we have is in the face of this kind of Nakba denial that's still happening. Not only is it happening about the past, it's happening in the present. How do we put that in its place? I don't mean to say that that's not a violence and that's not incredibly overwhelming in all of the spaces that all of us occupy, but it also is, it cannot frame how we think about how we think. And part of how we think is how we gather, be it material, how we gather material, and how we gather with each other in terms of who we are and what we are. One of the points that I would really like to make is, over the last year, storytellers from Gaza have become people who share information. It's how we understand what's happening there. And that's also not new, right? So storytelling is a cherished historical methodology in the Arab world and Arab culture, and in Palestine in particular. So we can see these continuities in spite of what this genocide is trying to do as far as breaking us, not only as a people, but also from our own pasts and our futures.
Thank you, Dr. Barakat. Everything you said just leads to a billion more questions in my mind that I could go off of. But everything that you were saying also connects to something that you were saying in your conceptual framing, which is positioning the past as part of this living and alive future, this present, whether it's the ongoing Nakba or preserving stories as a living archive of what Palestinians are experiencing, their lived experience in the present, and also connecting it back to the stories that have come before, and as well with Dr. Jamila's social media and what you're saying about the live streaming of the genocide right now. These are all part of a living archive. And I think that also connects a lot with what you were saying about settler power and settler temporality. And when it comes to settler colonialism and any ethnic cleansing that has occurred in the world, is that they position indigenous people as part of the past solely. They do not have a future, they do not have a present. And so this connects to my next question, which is, in many of your previous articles, you've argued that settler colonialism actually may not be the most appropriate lens through which to analyze Palestinian history, because it has this tendency to lead to a Zionist-centered reading of the narrative of Palestine. Instead, you advocate for an indigenous lens to locate Palestinian history outside of the settler colonial narrative, outside of the Zionist narrative. So I would like to invite you to take this opportunity to speak more to this methodology, to this lens, especially positioning this as a methodology of resistance.
You're right. I have, I didn't realize it would resonate this much, but I have asked myself and others to think about how we use and employ the analytic of settler colonialism. I should say that it's, of course, necessary to understand Zionism as an ideology, a project, and a state as settler colonialism. And that's terribly important and should never be set aside, right? But the challenge that I pose to myself and others is that we have to be careful not to reduce that to our own stories or confine them into that frame. I actually hesitate with rhetorical gestures. I now hesitate. I think I've learned over time with rhetorical gestures like methodologies of resistance, because there's so much to say and engage in terms of how we survive and how we imagine ourselves thriving. And right now, employing the rhetoric of resistance in the midst of this great resistance and survival is humbling or heavy. They're heavy themes in this time of genocide. But I think what I, to boil it down, what I'm trying to say, and this is what I say as I'm teaching, is that Zionism is a chapter in the larger book that's called Palestine, and we have to make sure that that's what it is. Settler colonialism is a project. It's an ideology. It's a project. It's a state, but it's not all of what we are. And one of the things that I think we need to remain incredibly vigilant about right now, and it's difficult because so much of what we document is destruction and murder. We have to be vigilant not to reduce ourselves to what is being done unto us. We are, the entirety of the Palestinian story and stories are not only about settler colonial Zionist violence. And it's not a simple formula, right? Because like I said, a lot of the documentation is about that. And this is so clearly an attempt at annihilation. I mean, they called it the apocalypse. There's nothing that's rhetorically hesitant in terms of Zionist violence right now, right? So it's difficult in that overwhelmingness to remember this. But I think, again, to just go back to storytelling, and if I can, Tam, I would say that our stories don't need to be preserved. I think we need to try to work, in spite of everything and in spite of this violence, to work outside of this constant notion of losing and loss, even though that's kind of an audacious gesture to the present and the past. I know that our stories will be ever changing. And a lot of the stories that I gathered in my book were about me trying to find my grandmother in other people's words. And they changed and they were alive. So they weren't, stories just don't, it cannot be reduced to this notion of preservation. And when they are, it becomes something else, right? And what does it look like? This is the audacious question. What does it look like as historians, as archivists? What does our process and methodology look like if we are not constantly worried about forgetting? If we're not constantly worried about preserving what has been lost or preserving all that remains? With all due respect to that kind of gesture that happened in the past, that's been done. And I think what we can do now is take a leap from, we're 4 generations now of historians, and Rosemary Sayev, as part of a lot of this project, taught us a lot about what collecting stories mean and how stories remain alive in generations, right? And so I think part of what we can do now and what we're doing now is listening, right? So that's part of the gathering, is listening. And there's something that's incredibly empowering about listening, that's full of grief, that's full of pain, and is also full of loss right now. But what does it mean that we don't work through a methodology of loss?
Thank you, Rana. I hear you on, for example, the way a narrow approach to settler colonialism as an analytic or an aspect of, or as Palestine, what's happening in Palestine, also makes invisible the larger regional and global processes and connections. It makes it harder for us to connect what's happening to Palestine to Iraq and to other sites, all around the world. And some people, just as you were talking, I'm thinking of sometimes how settler colonialism as a field of study can actually be another kind of disguise for whiteness, for example. Another kind of turning and looking and recentering the whiteness, the colonizer. And I'm sure there's a lot more we can all say about that. But what is significant for me is that gesturing at the broader history, the deeper histories, the broader connections globally and internationally. And certainly there is something always, like if we take the context of settler Canada, there's something really obvious when, there's this constant refrain that indigenous cultures and nations and sovereignties here are disappearing, when in fact they're vibrant, they're alive, whatever discursive erasure they may be subject to. And when in fact, there's more records and mention of indigenous nations in Canadian settler archival holdings than of any other group, far disproportionate to their numbers, so to speak. So just to give some other examples to elaborate what you're saying, I'm going to actually alternate right now from some of our prepared questions to take some audience questions, because there's one that connects very well to some of the things you were talking about. Short, sweet, but really complicated. There's a question: as we avoid presentism, is there a way to avoid falling into historical grief? And I'm just going to give you all the leeway to interpret or engage that question, whatever you think will help you share more of what you're thinking.
It's a really powerful question, right? So I think grief has been personally the biggest challenge over the last year. In spite of the fact that I'm a historian that should have a better sense of how to deal with loss and grief. And there's so much happening in the present. So I'm going to turn this around. There's so much happening in the present. There's so much violence. There's so much destruction that we literally are at a point now where we can't, there's no cumulative ability to be able to say, what happened. We're nearly 13 months into this intense and relentless violence. We're not even able to understand the levels of this violence because it's just so intense, and it's violence upon violence upon violence. I mean, they're bombing rubble at this point, right? So I actually think one of our challenges, and maybe it's one of these things that we can open up, because I have a friend and a colleague on campus who's a poet. The poets are often the most powerful storytellers, and he recently shared a piece about grief, saying that not only is time stolen and our lives stolen in this kind of relentless genocide, but the genocide is also stealing grief. Because there isn't time to grieve and mourn, because every day there's something new to grieve and mourn. So I think that's one of the challenges I think of before I even enter this question. But I think one of the things, again, I'd like to turn this around on its head, because I don't know if we should avoid historical grief. I don't know if that's something, but I think historical grief comes with a framework of what I was trying to say of longing and belonging. If we hold on to that relationality to each other and to this place, then that kind of love and that kind of holding, that methodology, has space for grief and mourning. Has to. And that's how we can that's the practice and the process that I think that relates the past and all of our iterations and understandings of the ever-changing past to all of our ways of coping and dealing with this incredibly vicious present, to hold on to, as again, I'll use the word, the audacious notion and the audacity in the midst of an attempted annihilation of the futures. And there's one thing that I do understand, that there's a kind of clarity that has come, ironically, with this iteration of violence and this genocide, is that there are different ways of thinking, obviously thinking about the future, but I think it's not going to work. I mean, Palestine will not be erased, and Palestinians will not be erased, and the south of Lebanon will not be erased, and Beirut will not be erased. We have to work through what's happening right now. I don't mean to take away from the kind of utter devastation of this loss, but if we think we are world making. If there is to be a humanity and this notion of humanism in the future, it will be written on and through and with Palestinian voices. It's one of those watersheds. Historians call it a watershed. This is, the last 13 months is an utter watershed, not only for Palestine and not only for the Arab world, but for the world writ large. I think what the Zionist settlers have done in terms of their violence, what the imperial powers have done in terms of not being only complicit, this is an imperial war, is that the old world, this is the classic phrase of Gramsci's, right, is that this old world is hanging on in this, all they have is violence now. That's all they have. There's no other strategic plan. And if all you have in your toolbox is violence, then that means that you're at your ends. So that means that we have to sort of think about the future as something that's far more open, and waiting to be written by us, waiting to be imagined by us. And there's something incredibly audacious about that in the midst of all this violence. But I firmly believe that, because the settlers and the imperial powers behind them have literally nothing other than violence. That's incredibly scary, and it's horror. It's horrific, and it's pure horror. But if that's all they have, that means they have nothing.
And it's such
I kind
a
of ran around that question.
No, never. And it's such a blatant violence too. It's like gloves off kind of violence in a way. And what I want to return to is what you were saying about care, actually, and how storytelling, poetry, all these living forms of archival preservation are preserved through care and like networks of care. And I think that's very telling in a world of violence, actually. And you said before in your framing that stories don't need to be preserved, they don't need to be recorded, they will just keep being told. And I think that's something that we can think to right now. In terms of the next question, it seems like we have quite a few questions wanting to know about more of the practices involved. So as we think about care and as we think about storytelling and these sorts of things, I want to turn the discussion a little bit towards practices. So we have one question from the audience. Can you discuss how you navigate the layers of the archivist's role in such a context, documenting in such a context, documenting and curating to preserve evidence, to contribute to history, to care for a global diasporic community? And considering you have more of a museums background as well, in addition to archives, I would, if you would like, you can reflect as well on museum practices as well, and what you've been doing with the Brazeit University Museum as well.
I want to say humbly that I'm in a community of archivists, but I am not an archivist. And I also want to say humbly that I'm in a community of people who run museums, but I'm not. I'm just a simple historian. And our museum is a university campus museum, so it's different, and there's a different kind of approach that one can make when you're on a university campus, I think. So my response and engagement to this question is in that space. I think, and this is something that Jamila can speak to far more than I can, so I'll just be, I'll humbly hand this over to her, but really quickly I'll say that there's different iterations of how, this is the historian's answer, right? There's different ways, as I look back, how Palestinians in particular and people who have been colonized in general engaged archival practices and archiving. And one of the main things that we do as students, when we were students and when we remain students as professors, is how do we deal with what Jamila mentioned earlier, is that a lot of our history materially lies within colonial archives. That's a devastating reality for anybody that has to do archival research within these colonial archives. And museums for that matter. I remember I was a student and I went to the British Museum and I saw a rock. I saw, because so much looting had been done. I didn't know how to function. I didn't know what to do. And I was less devastated, I don't know why, that when I went into the British colonial archives, because I suppose I knew what I was expecting. So there was, in that context, there's this rage. We were talking about grief earlier. I had, and I think we all do have this kind of rage of, there's so much stealing. There's stealing and looting, and one has to go into the colonial archives, the people who did the stealing and looting, in order to find our own stories or find a way to tell our stories. So that affected me in how I was engaging these institutions of European colonial modernity, trying to understand that they can still be engaged, but how do I engage them? It wasn't only about reading along or against an archival grain. It's much more complicated than that, I think. Then it became, in the space of our museum, of the Birzeit University Museum, it became a different challenge for me, because I was such a critic, and I was incredibly critical of gathering and collecting, of collecting and archiving. I was critical in the context, the positionality of somebody who wasn't doing it. And in this space, there's a practice and a practical question that's involved in this question, I think, that's embedded in it. And so I had to sit there with an incredibly beautiful and radical team and think about, well, we have collections here. How do we engage them? How do we not reproduce a colonial museum in Palestine? I mean, and I actually I had a chance to visit a few indigenous spaces on Turtle Island in the U.S. And I was thinking about that challenge, the collective challenge amongst all of us. And so we quickly made it into an intellectual space. And we tried to really foster and nurture that kind of conversation. And through the conversation, we were thinking about what inventory and survey mean that serves us. There's certain practices that are necessary. I learned what a session process are, right? I learned what numbering is. I learned what a unified lexicon in terms of describing is. But I was learning that for it to be something that was engaged by our people, something that was available and to be engaged by our people. And in the context of Palestine, because of our history, it became quickly obvious to all of us that we needed to figure out how to do a digital work. But that's also not new, right? Digital archives were something that were part of archive fever from the 1990s until now in Palestine. So it wasn't just about digitizing; it's about how do we read, be it a thobe or a talisman, an amulet, or a piece of art. How do we read it not as only an item that's a museum item, but also part of who we are? And I think that kind of change and that opening up a space. So right now in our university museum, we 2.5 years ago opened up a space called our Reading and Research Room. And that's now the heart of the museum. And it's where students gather and professors, where scholars gather, where we have reading groups, where we talk, where we work through the process of our survey and our inventory and our survey. And that meant that it was a space about people, for people, and with people. And that means it's not necessarily a formula, but there's an incredible sense of responsibility attached to it. Because at Birzeit, we as Palestinians are 15 million, and there's the diasporic aspect is embedded in this question. We are responsible to and for 15 million people, the majority of whom cannot enter the land of Palestine, and let alone get to Birzeit University. So that's also caring, is also understanding that that is this awesome responsibility. And so we have to think about what we do in terms of not only our practice, but our programming. And I just keep in my mind the critical lens of the historian is that there is something to be said about, neoliberalism is horrible, but there is something to be said about learning and teaching and study. You don't need to call it expertise for sure, but people who understand what caretaking is and caregiving is are the people who have taught me the most about what gathering in terms of archiving are. And that just means sort of understanding our process differently and giving space to process and practice and conversation. Ironically, one of the words that I stopped using is curation. I don't know if I fully understand what curation is because it's so overused as a term and it's become so it's been commodified in so many different ways that's why I sit and stay with care so much. And if that's where we're sitting, there is incredible, again, to go back to grief, there's an incredible sadness, but there's also we have to have space and hold space for that as well.
Absolutely, and I think the question of repatriation is vital. The question of hearing from people who are thinking and gathering and narrating and writing the past from different perspectives. This series, the Archives and Heritage for Palestine series, is all about bringing people who are historians, who are doing that particular kind of work. And just so our audience knows, our committee is also putting together events and symposium and panel featuring museum professionals, archivists, and other kinds of information heritage professionals in Palestine, Lebanon, and elsewhere. So please make sure to join our email list and stay tuned to hear all those range of voices, because they're all important, and that collective struggle is really important. We all have a role to play, and part of what these discussions are about is helping us understand the larger picture we're each part of in our different fleets and disciplines, many of which come from colonial histories of dividing colonized knowledges and pasts and lands and so on. I'm going to keep us on the museum piece because there's a number of museum people on our committee who have really made me profoundly understand the gap in these discussions in the museum field, at least this part of the world. One question from the audience is simply, why don't we have a Nakba museum? Tied to that is the question we had thought to ask you, Tam and I, about your analysis of the museumification of Lifta. And you've touched on some of these themes already, where you talk quite compellingly that even when the settler state tries to reckon with the memory of indigenous dispossession, they're still going to do that in a way that actually furthers that dispossession. And so again, this question of repatriation, ethical repatriation from museums and archives, what that might look like when we want to think about it in a way that serves indigenous people.
I think one of the things, one of the simple answer to this is what you just said, Jamila, which is coming together and having conversations, right? Serving indigenous people means, centering indigenous voices and indigenous practices. And I also, just to go back to maybe the Lifta part, I humbly talk about this because this is my forthcoming book, and it's actually the title. It's okay, but the title is actually Ongoing Return, Storytelling, and it's about ongoing return. So I don't actually use repatriation. I use return in my own lexicon. And I think about what that means in terms of the people returning to Palestine, and it means in the terms of everything returning. And return isn't a one-time event. Return isn't it's a methodology. So it's an ongoing return. It's always returning to Palestine in all the different ways. So Lifta is an utterly and incredibly personal story for me because it's my maternal line. Lifta is a village that's right northwest of Jerusalem. And it's where my grandmother, my mother's mother, and her entire family are from. And in April of 1948, they were forced by Zionist militias to leave their homes in Lifta. And this is a story that's told from the entire geography of Palestine. Lifta now is somewhat of an anomaly within a settler landscape because part of the village, because of historical reasons, it's a valley and it's a hill. Part of the village in the valley was not destroyed in 1948. The bulldozers did not go down into the valley and destroy it. So it's 57 remaining structures, and for generations now, and it's part of Jerusalem. It's an active part of Jerusalem. And so it became this kind of landscape scene for settlers to see what used to be. This is the museumification, right? So the idea of these homes, which are beautiful homes that are my maternal family's homes, became, in order to preserve them, the equation in front of Palestinians in this, what I described earlier as the indigenous bind, was that it has to be legible to settlers as well. And to be legible to settlers, it had to be museumified, which means that life and the ongoingness of life had to be removed from it. This idea, and of course, in order for the structures to remain, return could not have been an option, right? So I was using that in a very personal way because I wanted to find my grandmother's voice. I didn't know my grandmother in life. So I started talking to people in the village who lived in the village. And we're talking 2 generations on. Then in the next generation, which is my mother's generation, who carried these stories. And so I discovered that part of return is also, the vitality of these stories. And listening. Again, as I said, storytelling requires story listening, right? So that's a huge part of a methodology. That's clear to a certain extent, or it was clear to me. And then October 2023 happened, and the challenge became something else because I was arguing against ruins and ruinification. And again, it was this blast, and we didn't need October for this to happen, but everything feels like it's ruins now. People are living amongst rubble in Gaza and in the West Bank, I should say. So we have to think, again, this is a challenge of preservation, and it's a challenge of the existential challenge is what is the worth and value of a museum in light of all of this. And at the same time, we can see through studies that have been done that every piece of cultural heritage throughout the Gaza Strip from the north to the south were actively targeted. And again, we're talking about manuscripts like the Al-Mawdi Mosque that was 14th century manuscripts. These are things that were actively targeted and purposely destroyed. So we have another challenge in front of us. We document, and then what do we do? And how do we work through this? And they're contradictions. They're obviously contradictions. And the biggest challenge in the midst of all of this violence is that when we archive, when we're in a museum, how do we make sure that we're not reproducing a colonial museum? Because the most obvious answer to that is museums in European colonial modernity housed their colonial escapades. Right? We know this. Museums created, like, all of these structures and institutions of colonial modernity serve the purpose of European of the project of what is European fascism that we know that is modernity. How do we not do that? How do we not reproduce that? And that goes to the question of why do we not have a Nakba museum? I suppose I would turn that question is, why do we feel that we need to have a Nakba museum? Again, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. I don't pretend to have an answer to that question. But how do we frame our acts of gathering and as collecting and caring for and engaging in terms of each other and in terms of material history, this tangible and intangible heritage? I think it's maybe this is the historian responding, but I think this is the open question. And there's an enormous number of efforts that have happened in terms of both archives and museums. And I think throughout the former and currently colonized world. And I think there's a lot of lessons to draw from a lot of places, but Jamila is right. I think return as a framework, as we return to ourselves and to our land, is not new to us, and it's not new as a demand, and it's not new neither in Palestine nor in the Arab world, nor in the third world writ large. So there's almost two conversations that are being had, right? The conversation, which is the dismantlement of the powers and the institutions of European modernity, which is necessary, but also what do we want for ourselves and for each other, which is not the same conversation, but this one happens in order for this one to happen.
Thank you. Your framing of repatriation as return is so on the nose. And I want to say as well that, like you, my paternal line is from Lifta. So it's very
Really?
dear. Yes. Yeah. My father's side.
Rayan.
Yeah. Rayan. And what you said is very personal because there's a story in my family, not to, like take up too much time.
No, I
but
want to
just
hear
that,
it. I want to hear
yeah.
it.
there was so my father's family was displaced to Albira, which is also where my mother's family was displaced to, but she's from Jaffa. And when my grandfather was still alive, there was a situation which maybe we can talk to, behind the scenes, but where the Israeli intelligence agency came to how would you say, like a bit like antagonize him. And they tried to get information from him about one of my other family members, and he refused. And the intelligence agency said to him, "Well, why are you defending, your reputation here? Like everyone here in Albira knows you're not Albirawi. They know that you're an outsider. So what do you care about?" And my grandfather said, "Well, good if they don't think I'm from here, because I'm not from here. I'm from Lifta, and I will always be from Lifta, and my children will know they're from Lifta, and my grandchildren will know they're from Lifta." So what she said about return really, like sticks with me because
his great grandchildren will return to Lifta.
Exactly. And that, like you said before, return happens over and over again. And it will, yeah. So thank you.
Jamila, it's not this is just a share. It's not a sudfa. It's not a coincidence that two of us are from Lifta on this panel. It's just the power of Lifta.
It is.
Miyele.
I understand that I understand that we're a bit over time, so I do want to consult and see, like, we have 2 questions left for you. Should I ask the second last question or the last question here? What do you think, Jamila?
If you have the time, Rana, let's do the 2 questions. These are important conversations.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So is there anything that you'd like to share about what is currently going on at Berzait right now? What are faculty, students, and the community doing right now, especially facing the ongoing occupation and the genocide? If there's any comment you want to make about the connection between all these different facets of cultural erasure that we've been discussing and what's been happening in university education spaces. This is a very important question for us who are situated outside of Palestine, because it's a very different landscape that we're dealing with in terms of education and university spaces. So it would be great to hear about what's going on your end.
Okay. And the other question is about it. And about the museum, yeah? Is that the last question? Is there anything?
Yeah, we want to hear if there's anything you want to tell us on what's going on your campus. I mean,
okay, I actually,
yeah.
I wanted to say, okay, I'll talk about Berzait. That's a whole other conversation, but I'll try to give the audience resources by which to be able to follow this stuff. To say earlier, in the question Jamila asked about archivists and museums, I need to. It's incredible that there's a generation that I'm a part of and it's not a coincidence that we're female historians, that write about reconsidering archives, reconsidering how we engage archives, reconsidering what archives are. And there are people like Jamila. But I want to acknowledge just 3 Palestinian historians that have taught me a lot. Shireen Saikali writes incredibly beautifully about archives, and her new project is one that turns the head on how we read archives. But there was a project that was done that included Shireen Saikali, Mezna Qattu, who's I'm sure you all know, and Hana Suleiman. The 3 of them, in all of their different and disparate places and spaces, have been thinking and teaching us about how to work through thinking about archives as historians, and through the existential crisis of the last 100 years in Palestine, not only the last year. In terms of Birzeit, I think one of the things that I would like to say in the way that I want to share this space with those women is I also want to share this space with the generations that came before. So Birzeit's really interesting because with Jamila, I'm sure she sees this in Beirut, is that we are the product of generations of people who've been thinking about these questions, right? And that we stand on their shoulders in order to be able to think in the ways that we do. If they had not done what they did, we wouldn't have the space to be able to do what we do. And so if there wasn't this iteration that happened in, right after 1948, and then when we see the kind of the initial gathering of archives by the PLO and by different iterations in Beirut, you can see that if that work by Walid al-Khaldi hadn't been done, if the work by the Birzeit Research Center hadn't been done in the late 70s and 80s of documenting the Nakba, then we wouldn't be able to think about thinking outside of those paradigms of loss, because they were able to document, and they were able to use the word you used earlier, work through preservation, which means that we can have this space of being critical of what that means now. We're not starting from scratch or from zero. At Birzeit, I would like to say that a lot of this conversation about archives and museums could easily be extended into universities, because as one can see and witness in Gaza, is that like archives, and perhaps I don't want to make this a competition, but these institutions have been directly targeted. There was 22 universities standing in Gaza on October 6th. Right now, there are no universities that are functional and standing in Gaza. The libraries of these universities have been destroyed, and I'm sure you've seen these photos. In the West Bank, we stand in the shadow of Gaza, and now we stand in the shadow of South Lebanon. The kind of violence that's happening here also didn't begin in October, and universities are directly targeted by the settler army and the armies of settlers. There's a reason why these spaces of knowledge exchange are so incredibly frightening to settlers, and why they represent a danger, because it's about what we're doing, right? It's about nurturing and caregiving and giving care to who we are as a people. And intellectualism is something that has been directly targeted, and we're not surprised by that, because we know that this is a colonial methodology. So I would ask your audience to actually follow, this is what the kids do, follow the Instagram of the Right to Education campaign at Birzeit University, and you can get updates. Right now at my university, there's more than 150 students who've been captured and stolen from us as a university and from their families, and are currently incarcerated, held captive in Zionist prisons because they are our students. They're actively targeting our campuses, and they're actively targeting our students and our professors and our employees. So when we talk about destruction in terms of libraries, museums, and archives, I think it's an equally important discussion to talk about universities, because these universities hold all 3 of those entities as well. And so I would urge your audience to actually think about this. I think we're beyond the point and the threshold of talking about academic freedom. I think we've gone beyond that, because this is just such a level of violence. But I think it's incumbent upon us to think about what it means that a state whether it be a rogue state or not, so actively targets these institutions and the people of these institutions. And what Tam, you were saying earlier, has been greeted with such utter and deafening silence in certain geographies. And I think in thinking about the global intifada at universities like the ones that you are at, when the students at your universities in those spaces declared certain spaces, and particularly Tam, you're at a university now that performed one of the greatest crimes against indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, when our students stood and said, stop the genocide, and declared emancipated spaces. What they were saying were, they were proclaiming that the future is ours and we have to fight for it. And so I think it's important for us to make those connections and to understand that what students were doing in the global intifada, and hope continue to do, is about listening to each other. And I think if we want, again, to be audaciously hopeful, if we forge a notion of what futures are and what they can be, it is through those declarations of emancipation and spaces. And it's through our determination to say that knowledge exchange in all of the forms that we hold them, as archivists, as museum folk, as librarians, as professors on campuses, that exchange of knowledge is the methodology that shall open up these notions of what liberation is and what liberating spaces are.
Rana,
I turned
you've
into a
answered our
politician.
last question as well. So I'm gonna just, instead of asking this question, I'm gonna read this beautiful comment in the chat from Khaldun Bshara. So it's forever as part of this recording. In 2010, I met a Liftawi taxi driver who told me that his grandfather purchased a plot of land in Lifta after the Nakba because he was sure that he was going to return. Liftawis never lose hope.
Tahayati to my colleague and friend Khaldun Bshara, who's a professor of anthropology at Birzeit University.
Amazing. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Bshara, and sharing that. I'm just going to then move us into some concluding remarks. I'll take that moment I have for my concluding remarks to share with you, Rana, that I also have been physically ill trying to get into museums and archives. I actually wrote the first few pages of my dissertation, my PhD thesis, talking about that in terms of my fieldwork in Paris. Obviously, as a Lebanese, I have to go to Paris to find our history, since France was our colonizer and continues to think itself to be something in terms of Lebanon. And part of what I write about in there is that by the time I finally got to the Louvre, I couldn't go in. I was literally physically so ill from having gone to all these places and seeing all the glorification of empire, the looting. And when I think of all the professionals behind that, and the illness they caused me, they cause you, they cause all of us. I know that once that's not there, we've actually done the work we need to in our professions. And I'll end there. Please, Tam, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, there's so much I would love to say, but I'll keep it brief, and I'll just say that you touched a lot on the looting that has occurred throughout Palestine's history. And these records are in every colonizer's archives, the British archives, as well as Israel's archives. And I've also experienced that sickness. I've done a lot of research into the Israel State Archives and how they document Palestinians. And it's not just the looting, but it's also the very real harm in how they document Palestine in their own records, and how that twists the narrative, and how that has real world consequences on the ground for Palestinian presence and futures. And that's something that needs to be talked about as well. And everything that we're doing in these panels, in these speaker series, in your scholarship, the scholarship of all of us, is rewriting that narrative and doing it from that Indigenous Palestinian perspective. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being in conversation.
Thank you. I just want, if I could say, I just want to thank you, Jamila. Thank you, Tam, and thank the entire team. This is an incredible project, and it's my honor to have my voice amongst you and to be in conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me and holding space for me.